Good evening and welcome to the final Q&A of the year. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, co-chair of the Joint Council on Closing the Gap with Indigenous Australians, Pat Turner, South African-Australian author Sisonke Msimang, leader of the opposition, Anthony Albanese, and Nobel Prize winner for physics and Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, Brian Schmidt. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Well, over the last 12 years, there have been almost 500 Q&As and many thousands of questions. We'll start tonight with an audience question from Elaine Jontek.
Fires have torn through millions of hectares and claimed hundreds of homes, and 6 Australians have tragically lost their lives. Rural communities and firefighters are exhausted. Sydney is in a haze of smoke. In this bushfire emergency, is it time now for national leadership to bring new responses through a summit with all levels of government to discuss the best ways to manage national parks and the risks of people living in fire-prone areas? We have more hot days ahead. Is it time for a better crisis management plan for our fires?
Malcolm Turnbull, we'll start with you.
Well, the answer is yes. We have to recognise we have a hotter and drier climate. That's the consequence of global warming, and that's going to mean more fires and hotter fires. And these fires can be 1,000 degrees Celsius. They will melt everything except steel. You know, our firefighters, who we must honour and thank here and support, are taking on unimaginable challenges, getting worse all the time. And so we do have to come together and recognise that the situation with fires is going to become worse. That is the inevitable consequence of a hotter and drier climate, and that means we need stronger and more coordinated responses. We have to support our firefighters as they put themselves and their lives on the line to keep us safe.
So, Malcolm Turnbull, is it time to actually recognise this as a national security threat and build a national force, well-equipped, possibly with its own fleet of aerial bombers, to actually take this on? Because as of now, there's been no national response.
Well, it's always been, as you know, essentially a state and local government issue, and of course the fire, here in New South Wales, the Rural Fire Service is largely a volunteer force. But you know, the reality is, as Elaine's just said, we are seeing more and hotter fires. It is the consequence of a hotter and drier climate, as our Nobel Prize-winning physicist, I'm sure, will confirm. You know, that is not rocket science. That is what you get if you have a hotter and drier climate, more fires and hotter fires. And so we have to review the measures we've got to defend ourselves against fires and upgrade and improve them, because the challenge has changed, so you cannot keep on responding in the same way you have in the past. And the fire chiefs that have, the retired former fire chiefs that have been creating a sort of coalition in respect of this have been talking about having more water bombers, and that, you know, they're the experts. We've got to be guided by them.
Well, there were 23 of them earlier this year. They urgently tried to meet the Prime Minister over a number of months. He refused to meet them. Now, I'm just wondering whether that was the appropriate response from a national leader when 23 of the leading firefighters and emergency leaders from the past decades come forward to make their case.
Well, I'll leave Albo to critique ScoMo, that's his day job. But I think whether regardless of the meetings and who you meet with and so forth, you get back to this reality. Look, you know, the fires, I'll just tell you about a fire. Remember the Black Saturday fires in Victoria in 2009? Lucy and I went to the fire ground after those fires, and there were many people killed there. They were shocking tragedy. And we saw cars which had been caught up in the fire, which people had been in, and there was nothing left except the steel. The glass had melted and flowed down over the car, over what was left of the dashboard and the floor. The aluminium in the wheels had melted and was left run out on the ground. That is what our firefighters and our communities in rural areas and areas around our cities are facing. And so we have to recognise this is a national security issue. I mean, when Australians' lives are at risk, when they are being threatened, when their families and their homes and their crops and their properties and everything they hold dear is being put at threat, that's a national security issue. If it isn't a national security issue, what is? And it requires a national response.
The national government to deal with.
The national government has to provide leadership.
Okay.
That's what the Australian government does. I mean, when we had the terrible truck attacks, for example, in Europe, you remember the terrible attack in Nice on the terrorists drove the truck down the road there. As Prime Minister, I brought together all the state leaders, state police, local government, the private sector, and said, right, we need to have and coordinate a crowded places strategy. This has, obviously the federal government can't do everything, but the federal government's job is to lead. And this is an issue that needs leadership. We cannot kid ourselves that we are not going to face more and hotter fires. That is the consequence of global warming.
Okay, we'll come back to you on that. Pat Turner, you want to get in?
Yes, I do. And thank you very much for the question, Elaine, because it's been a tragedy, really, to see our country just being erased. And I think that there's a lot that Australia has to learn from my people, the Aboriginal people, who cared for this country for 60,000 years, who have very sound fire management practices that could easily be adapted into modern Australia and could also create sound employment opportunities. But it has to be land management on an annual basis, year in, year out. You can't just have clearance happening just before summer. And, you know, the water bombers and all of those things are great and they do a fantastic job, but you've got to have the water to pick up in the first place. And we're running very short of that. So I just think that some land management practices that have been employed by Aboriginal people can easily be learnt and adapted, and our people could get some sound employment opportunities by being able to be employed in land management roles on an annual basis, year in, year out, to make sure that the environment is cared for as it should be.
Okay, Anthony Albanese, thank you very much. You just heard Malcolm Turnbull call for a national response. We haven't seen that yet. Do you agree with the questioner that's what is required?
I do, and I wrote to Scott Morrison 3 weeks ago. He wrote back to me saying it wasn't required and that everything was in hand. Well, quite clearly it's not. And I agree with Malcolm that this is an issue that needs leadership, but it also needs coordination. Yes, the state governments will be responsible for emergency services, but fires don't recognise state boundaries. Local government doesn't recognise that the fires aren't burning in one local government area. At the moment, here there is a single fire that is burning from the Hawkesbury right up to Singleton, a single fire. And we know that this is connected with climate change. And to say that is not to dismiss the need to deal with the immediate, which is keeping people safe, keeping property safe, the immediate response. But we need to accept that we need adaptation, we need mitigation, we also need a long-term plan to deal with climate change, because you have areas that are burning that have not burned before because they're drier because of what's been happening on this continent in recent times. This is an emergency. It's affecting our security, it's affecting our health, it's affecting the economy, and it's affecting the environment. And there hasn't been, this is the first year for many years in which there's been just one COAG meeting. There was due to be a meeting in the latter half of this year and it was cancelled. Now, if there's some inconvenient facts to be found about investments that should have been made, well, so be it. We need to actually ensure that we respond, and the national government should be providing leadership on these issues.
What about a national firefighting force ready with its own fleet of water bombers, for example?
Well,
I mean,
that was one of the points I raised, a number of points that have been raised, not because I'm an expert, have been raised by the experts. I met with Greg Mullins and the former fire chiefs in Canberra. These are men and women who have been working their whole lives. They're essentially mainly retired people who've been running rural fire services, running emergency services, running national parks, who know what is going on. And surely, and I agree with Pat's suggestion as well, we could learn a hell of a lot from First Nations people who did look after the land in much better than those who've arrived since. And we should be prepared to consider any measures, but that happens through dialogue. That's how you get solutions.
yeah, I've got to say this. I mean, is there a Canberra bubble here? Because we had a whole week of Parliament last week. Labor didn't ask a single question on this subject.
Well, that's not right. Well, that's not right, Tony. We had a whole response in terms of a statement from the Prime Minister, a statement from me that responded. I put
There were no questions in question time, that's what I'm saying.
That's not the only part of Parliament, Tony, as you know. We have responded on those issues, and on a range of issues we actually tried to raise, and we were shut down on 30 occasions in Parliament last week.
OK, let's move on. We've got a question from the Fire Zone. You're watching Q&A Live. Our next question is a video from Bruce Munro in Long Beach, New South Wales, on the edge of an out-of-control fire at Currowan in the state's south.
Hi, this is a question for the panel. In this trial by fire, how can Morrison and a largely silent Susan Ley not be treated as deniers guilty of collaborating and co-creating this fire disaster we find ourselves in? As Liberal Nationals work actively to obscure urgent action, is it from being in the pocket of the coal lobby there really is soot on all their hands? Spoken to you from the edge of the Currowan fireground. Thank you.
Brian Schmidt, I'll bring you in. And obviously the core of that is a claim that this is a climate-related fire.
Well, as we know, it's hard to put a single fire to climate, but the scale of this unfolding disaster really is something that seems to be made much worse by the prevailing rise in temperatures, the drought, and all the things that are associated with climate change. So it is clearly related. We need to be taking action. Action's going to take 30, 50, even 100 years to sink in. So I think this is a warning call. I don't think we should point fingers and blame people for this fire. That's not responsible. But responsible would be saying, this is the new normal. I don't like this normal. It's going to get worse from here. It is time to act.
Are you surprised there hasn't been a national response?
I think that the size...
Apart from sympathy
well,
for victims.
so there needs to be a national response because the scale of it is so large. It just simply is overwhelming. For example, the local councils around where I live, because we can call this a Canberra bubble thing, and I can tell you we're choking and smoke in Canberra right now. So this is something that has a scale that we will have to work nationally. But as Pat said, we actually need to get out in front of this, realize we're going to have to take a systems approach, and we're going to have to start managing the land differently than we have, and we're going to have to respond differently, all at scale with systematic thinking.
Sisonke.
Yeah, which is precisely, I think, why there's been silence on the part of the government on this issue. I think that's the underlying, that's the elephant in the room here, that the silence is due to this very strange ambivalence that the current government has towards climate change and towards the climate emergency. And so in the absence of clarity about some pretty crazy ideological things that should have long been chucked out so that we can just move ahead and deal with both short-term emergencies as well as the long-term structural changes that we need to make in this country. In the absence of that clarity, I think we have this weird silences, these inability to pull together meetings and coordinate, because it means accepting the truth. And that I think is a real tragedy right now.
I'm going to go to another question on this. It's from Stephen Sholop. Stephen.
Malcolm Turnbull. Now that the climate change do-nothings are in power, do you regret not having stuck to your beliefs when you were Prime Minister? Wouldn't you at least have gone down fighting?
Well, thank you, Stephen. And we used to debate together, by the way, so you've lost none of your debating skills in that question. Well, Stephen, I guess I did go down. I lost the support of the party room, but I did my best to maintain and deliver action on climate change, supporting renewable energy, supporting the transition to a zero emissions electricity sector. My sincere belief, and it's reasonably well informed, is that the way we will cut our greenhouse gas emissions, as we must do, is to get to zero emission electricity, which we can do because the cheapest form of new electricity is renewables, wind and solar generally, plus storage. Pumped hydro. I got started the biggest pumped hydro system in the Southern Hemisphere, and Snowy 2 and other projects. That's our future. Now, we've got to plan it, obviously, because you've got to make sure you don't go broke or have the lights go out on the way through. But if you do that...
In speaking to your debating opponent there, you seem to have avoided some of his key points, which are about whether or not there's a problem at government level with climate denial.
Oh, there is. There is. Well, Stephen and everyone, Stephen's absolutely right. I mean, I said this at the time. The coalition has a fundamental problem in dealing with climate change, because there is a group within the Liberal parties and the national parties who deny the reality of climate change and will oppose to the point of essentially blowing up a government, my government in this case, if there is action taken to reduce emissions. And we saw that. I mean, the National Energy Guarantee had more support than any energy policy we've ever had. It had the support of unions, of industry. It had been back and forth to the party room and through the cabinet many times, but that became, because it dared to address the issue of cutting emissions, because it dared to contemplate that climate change might be real, that became then the lever that the insurgents used to blow up the government. And that is why, that's the only reason why the NEG is no longer government policy. Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg were as enthusiastic for it as I were. But they know that the government's policy on climate is being held to ransom by a group of deniers within the party and indeed in the media and other sections outside the parliament
can I just
that
put a,
support it. So therein lies the problem.
Can I put a brief question to you? And that is, we were talking earlier about the 23 former fire chiefs who tried to get to speak to the Prime Minister. They called themselves the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action Group. And I'm wondering if that's why they didn't get to see the Prime Minister.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to ask him that.
What's your assessment?
Well, look, seriously, I'm not here to run the ruler over Scott Morrison's appointments diary. He can, I'm sure he can manage that himself. But whether you have the meeting or not, the bottom line is you've got to address the issue, and the key, as I said, is to get to zero emission electricity, which we can do. We can have zero clean electricity and much cheaper electricity. That's the thing. So we can do both now, because renewables plus storage are cheaper. Secondly, you then electrify the industry and transport, so you have, clean electricity, transport becomes electric, and other sectors, and so that is how you drive your way to a much lower emission economy, and one, I might say, that will result in more affordable and available energy. So I mean, so we've got all the tools. What the problem is that people are treating on this, on the right, they are treating what should be a question of physics and science and economics and engineering as though it were an issue of religion and belief, and it's nuts.
Okay. Anthony Albanese, I'll get you quickly to respond to that. Then there's a question for you.
Well, just quickly, I think that Malcolm's right in one respect, but from my perspective, I've sat there since 2013. The Australian government has not had a comprehensive energy policy. They have had some good things happen, like Snowy 2, Hydro 2, but there is no overall policy, and it's quite extraordinary. This is a third-term government now, and what business is crying out for is investment certainty, and that's why Kerry Schott came up with the NEG, which would have sailed through the parliament. 140 people would have voted in favour of the NEG, in my view, in the House of Representatives, but a few troglodytes sitting there holding the environment to ransom. And the real tragedy is that good policy on climate change can create jobs, can reduce prices, as well as reducing emissions at the same time. Because renewables are the cheapest form. There won't be, as much as the government, Matt Canavan and these people say there'll be a new government subsidy for a new coal-fired power station. There won't be a new coal-fired power station built in Australia because the economics doesn't stack up. It's the economics that drives change through an economy. And it so happens that good action on climate change is an opportunity. And that's the tragedy of the debate that we're having at the moment, I think, is that lost opportunity. We can be a clean energy superpower for the world. A whole lot of the minerals like lithium and other resources that will drive that. Copper will go into the electric cars. We could actually be, if we take this opportunity, the clean energy superpower for the world.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because the next question is for you, and it's about a debate that's going on inside your own party. It's from Samuel Turren.
Hi, Mr. Albanese. I'm asking a question. You, in the midst of courting the coal miners in Queensland, and while I acknowledge that these workers are just as important as inner city workers, is it not time that we consider how these jobs will be sustainable into the future? And I'm wondering if Labor is committed to a Green New Deal similar to that being discussed in the US, UK, EU and Canada.
Anthony Albanese.
Look, we're committed to strong action on climate change, but I'll say this about people who work, who are miners. I don't think it advanced the cause. Indeed, the only political benefit of the convoy, for example, through Claremont in central Queensland was to see people yelling at people who were just trying to provide a living for their family. I don't think that advances the debate at all. I think that people should be treated with respect. When it comes to our domestic emissions, there's a need to take strong action to have strong targets, and we will do so and have mechanisms to drive that through. When it comes to exports, the majority of Queensland coal exports are metallurgical coal that's used for steel. At the moment, there's nothing else that can substitute in there, so that will continue for a period of time. When it comes to other agreements, the international agreements which are there, Kyoto, when it comes to the Paris Accord, have all been based upon domestic emissions, that is, demanding that nation states take action to reduce their impact on the climate. That's the only international game in town. You don't count it twice in terms of stopping trade. There are no agreements that do that. And if we engage in that debate, what we won't be able to do is to unify the country to try and take action. Now, when coal-fired power is closing down, agreements have been reached, for example, over Liddell Power Station. AGL and the unions, it's about a transition, making sure that those people have security and are looked after. As the economy transitions into clean energy, and we want the international economy to transfer to clean energy as well. But the problem the one thing, I won't even get into sending Angus Taylor to Madrid, but the problem is that Australia has no credibility while our emissions are going up and whilst we're trying to have an accounting trick in order to meet the Paris targets. So we need strong domestic action, but we also need to be strong players globally, because it's through those international agreements that will change the demand for coal.
Okay, I'm going to have to bring in some other panellists. So, Sisonke, I saw you shaking your head while listening to that.
I know, I wish I wasn't sitting next to him, because I want to disagree strongly.
That's okay.
And it's harder when you're sitting next to someone. I think that this is a classic example of short-termism. And it's a short-termism we just cannot afford when it comes to climate. And so I think what it feels like to me is sacrificing my 8-year-old and 11-year-old's futures at the altar of political expediency, which is about thinking about the now and not planning for the future. And that kind of sucks.
But don't you think that we need to have a transition? You can't just, you know, go bang.
Absolutely.
A majority of the lights are being kept on here with fossil fuels. What we need to do is to transition so that doesn't happen. But you can't do that in an instant.
You certainly can't.
And you need to have a plan to do it.
You certainly need a plan to do it, and we've wasted a huge amount of time in this country having a debate that is an unnecessary debate, because that would have been time spent planning and into this transition into a green economy. But I also think that if you look at all the figures that have come out that, you know, assess what happened earlier this year with the election, the one clear message is that while people didn't trust Labour on the economy and had questions about tax plans, people do trust Labour on environment. And it seems to me that this move is not a smart one, just on a pragmatic level, where people actually think that Labour is doing okay when it comes to the environment. And so I think a plan around coal at this point just doesn't feel like it makes
I was going to hear from Brian on this subject. And bear in mind, one of the arguments being made by the Prime Minister at the South Pacific Forum was that no matter what we do in Australia, the Chinese are going to wipe it out by building coal-fired power stations, as they did over the past year with $30 billion in 27 countries, I think it was.
So there is a transition going on, and it is true that there are some coal-fired power plants being built, but they're going to be really problematic in probably 10, 15, 20 years. It's not clear to me that's a smart investment right now. So our coal miners are facing, I would say, a rocky trajectory. And what I think I see missing is that sense of the future. How are we going to create this new energy future? How are we going to go through and make what could easily be a $1 trillion export industry for Australia, doing green coal, green steel, green aluminium, being able to go through and export things like hydrogen? Those are all things that we probably have the best cost basis in the world to do. It's a huge opportunity. And so, well, I think we need to go through and not close the gates today. Whenever we go through and say, yes, coal today, I would like also to be planting the flag for tomorrow at the same time and put those things firmly together.
But that's precisely what we're saying.
Well, I guess I haven't seen the future plans yet to my satisfaction. ANU is going through, and we're investing our own money trying to get things going up in the Northern Territory and in Western Australia, because there isn't anything happening on the federal or the state level at the scale required.
Okay, I'm going to move on because we've got quite a few questions to get through. Now, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, very unlikely with this panel. But if you do, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT, ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Mick Scarcello.
As an Aboriginal person, on average, I'm going to die 10.6 years younger than a non-Aboriginal person. In fact, by current statistics, and with the rise in the retirement age, I'm likely to die before I actually retire. So why can't I access my super 10.6 years earlier and retire 10.6 years earlier? Because if that was the case, the gap in life expectancy would close a lot quicker.
Yeah, Pat Turner, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't rule the super funds, and I guess that there's a case for people to argue for their fund to be, or their pension, or whatever, lump sum to be taken out earlier.
Is there an essential logic if Aboriginal people or Indigenous people are going to live fewer years, they ought to be able to access their pensions earlier?
I don't necessarily see that, but I think there's much more work that has to be done to lessen the difference. In fact, the life expectancy gap between our people and other Australians is widening because other Australians are living a lot longer and our people are still dying too early, 10 to 12 years earlier. And the way to close that gap is to improve the living environment and the housing conditions and environmental health, comprehensive primary health care. They are the areas that require massive investment along with education. And I'm afraid to say that right now the Commonwealth Government is walking away from Aboriginal housing, and that is a tragedy, and that cannot be allowed to happen, and we have to get the Commonwealth involved.
Malcolm Turnbull, what do you think? And what do you think about the logic of what Mick is saying?
Well, it's not an argument I've heard before, but Mick, I think the averages can be quite misleading, and I think Pat would understand this better than me as an expert in the health area, but simply saying the average life expectancy of Aboriginal Australians is lower than non-Aboriginal Australians, that is a fact, and that's something that has to be addressed, and that's a gap that has to be closed by making sure those health challenges among First Australian communities are addressed. But it may not necessarily mean that you, as one individual, is going to, live less than somebody who is not Aboriginal but has had a similar history to you in terms of health and, upbringing and exercise and all of those factors that affect your health. So I think you've raised an important issue. If I was still in the business of government, I'd be saying that's a very important issue, and I'd be wanting to talk to Pat and others and get a good insight into it, because you've got to remember that superannuation is meant to provide money for people in retirement. If people can take it out 10 years sooner, but then they don't die 10 years sooner, they'll be very short of money and in their old age.
Turnbull, Mick wants to get back in. I'll go back to the question.
Yeah, well, my problem is that as this retirement age rises and the gap widens, I'm not going to get a chance to spend my super. I'll be dead.
Well, no, but Mick, that's the problem with averages. You see that as to the average, I'm not challenging the average, but the question is, what about you? What about each individual? And so an argument could be made, that people with particular health conditions, particular prognoses of life expectancy, should be able to access their super earlier, regardless of their, whether they're Aboriginal or not Aboriginal. In other words,
Malcolm,
focus on people's life expectancy
Malcolm, we'll
instead.
shift it around the panel. Sisonke wanted to jump in, and I would like to hear from Anthony Albanese.
So I think that it's a really interesting way of thinking. But what you're doing is applying a technical fix to a much larger structural problem. And the structural problem is the gap exists because of racism against Indigenous people in this country. So again, it's a short term. So in the short term, what you're saying is collectively as a group, Indigenous people live shorter lives and therefore should be able to access the benefits of what it means to be a citizen in this country. And my question is, why isn't everyone else appalled by that, to the point where we address the racism problem rather than accepting the reality that life is going to be shorter for our fellow Indigenous citizens of this country? That's the bigger question.
Let's throw that one across the panel to Anthony Albanese. The closing the gap issue was where the question started. Of course, we got a bit sidetracked with the superannuation issue, but there's a core argument there, isn't there?
Absolutely, and it's a tragedy that it's now more than a decade since the apology, which is when part of that was that First Nations people said, that's good, but we want an ongoing issue of closing the gap. We want targets, we want them to be identified, we want an annual report to the Parliament. And the truth is that in many of the areas we have not made gains at all, and indeed in some areas are going backwards.
Do you agree with Sisonke that the problem is racism?
The problem depends how you define it. Certainly there's racism because when you look at the facts, if people have lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality, more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be incarcerated, etc., on the basis of their birth, then obviously there's a structural problem with our society that we need to deal with, all of us, not just government, but civil society as well.
We've got another question on this general subject of racism. It's from Hanan Maliki.
When politicians debate over population levels, refugees and border protection, claiming to be protecting Australians, some are using language which infects society with bigotry and racism. Do politicians understand how this negatively impacts high school students like me, a second-generation Australian from an Arab background and of Muslim faith, in truly feeling that sense of belonging in the only place I call home?
Sisonke, I'll come back to you since you started down this path.
You're coming back to me because I'm black. And the question was,
No,
do
because
politicians...
you raised the issue of racism
I did raise
a moment ago.
I did raise the issue of racism, but part of I think the accountability falls with the people who are tasked with our society with dealing with these broader structural questions. So I have no problem answering the question. I love to talk about racism, but I think it is important to direct the question to where the problem lies. And the problem does not lie with black people who can answer the questions about racism. The problem lies with where the source, the genesis of racism is in our society. That's with people who hold positions of responsibility. So I do think it's important for the politicians who Hanan has asked the questions to answer the question.
So, Brian, I'll come to you and then I'll hear from the former Prime Minister here. We can certainly go to him.
So, as a university where I have 100 people from 100 countries and all sorts of ethnic backgrounds, I see the tension caused by exactly what you talk about. We are talking about problems and then we describe them in terms of people's characteristics, their backgrounds, in a very broad brush. So there are issues that need to be dealt with, but they are issues around actions. They're not around classes of people. So I do think we are very much in danger. And this is where I think the media has a great deal to do, and I would say the ABC has this problem along with everyone else, of going through and tarring with a very broad brush groups of people for problems that are faced. And we need to be much more disciplined because it affects people and it affects my students every day.
Hannah, do you mind if I come back to you? Because I'm interested that you've said that politicians make you think, what they're saying makes you think they're infecting society with bigotry and racism. Are there any particular examples that you can remember?
Just in social media, when politicians talk about something that targets my particular, whether it's my religion or my culture.
You're thinking of Islamophobia?
Yeah.
Yes.
And when I come back to school, people are always having conversations about it, and I feel like it's always targeting towards me.
Malcolm Turnbull, as a former Prime Minister, does that sort of disturb you to hear that a young woman whose loyalty is to Australia feels this way?
Well, it disturbs me. It doesn't surprise me. Throughout my public life, whether I was Prime Minister or in other positions, not many days passed when I didn't talk about the importance of Australia as a multicultural nation and the fact that we are the most successful multicultural society in the world and that we define ourselves by reference to the political values we share, not by the colour of our skin or our religion or our ethnic background or cultural background. And so the inclusiveness of Australia is the great genius of the Australian project. Now, those people who seek to divide us are undermining our success and our future and our safety. And dealing with Islamophobia, which you raised there with Tony a minute ago, let me be very clear. Those people in our society who seek to tag the crimes of a tiny number of Islamist terrorists like ISIL, tag that onto all Muslims, are doing the work of the terrorists. Because what does the terrorist want? The terrorist wants you and other young Muslim Australians to believe that you're not really part of Australia, that this is not your home, That's what the terrorist wants. So the people who demonise Muslims and demonise Islam are doing the work of the terrorists, and that's
Can I just ask,
that's why we've got to stand up.
Did you see that from politicians within your own coalition?
I wouldn't. No, I'm not going to buy into that. But you know what I mean. It is very. You see it in the media. I mean, there's a. You know, I'll end up talking all night about this, but this is something I'm very... good, but I'm going to be brief. I'm just going to be brief, but I just say this to you. We have a vital vested interest in defending our great success as a multicultural nation, and that is why when anyone seeks to divide us, when anyone seeks to turn one group of Australians against another, that has to be resisted, and that's why we must always have zero tolerance for racism, zero tolerance for religious bigotry. We've got to recognise that what we have in this country is so precious. I mean, people are fighting with each other all over the world, and yet here in this city of Sydney alone, 36% of the people in this city were not born in Australia. The national figure's about 30%. Now, how do we achieve that and live together in relative harmony? It's because of mutual respect. And we've got to stand up for that. And Hanan, you are absolutely right to raise it. And that is what you and your classmates and your teachers should do, because in defending that mutual respect, they're defending the Australia we love.
Now, Pat Turner, racism and bigotry from politicians, is that familiar to you?
Oh, yes.
From the country that you grew up in. And of course, you grew up in Australia.
I did.
Coming from people who've been here forever.
Absolutely. In Alice Springs, in Central Australia. And so I've lived with it, you know, all my life. And 70% of Australian people recently identified, believe that racism is well alive in this country. And just as we have to act collectively and responsibly as fair-minded Australians to address issues like racism and climate change and our futures, to make sure that our younger generations have as productive a future as what, you know, my baby boomers generation have had. We've got to address these issues collectively, but call it out. But one thing I'm very wary of is the role of social media and the misuse of social media by the bigots and so on to get their messages across. And I know every young person loves social media, but personally, the more I see of that manipulation of it, the more I hate it.
OK, we've got another question, different subject, from Luther Kamaran.
The question is for Pat Turner. Many Indigenous leaders have called for enshrining an Indigenous voice in the Constitution. But to make a change to the Constitution, we need to hold a referendum. The question is it fair by the Indigenous people that all Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have a say on that voice or that decision? In other words, shouldn't it just be the Indigenous people who should have the right to say that?
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting question. We would like to have had the right to determine that and to negotiate it directly with the Australian Parliament, so the government and the major parties. But it hasn't been the case. The current government has ruled it out in terms of constitutional enshrinement. The Labor Party has ruled it in. And quite frankly, we just don't have the numbers to affect the vote. And any change to the Australian Constitution must be done by referendum. So that's the way. And, you know, quite frankly, we need the majority support of voters in every state to vote with us. And that can only come from having a united parliament supporting a yes vote in a constitution. At the moment, there's no other way to do it.
Anthony Albanese.
Well, we support enshrining the voice to Parliament in the Constitution. This has been through an extensive process of consultation of Indigenous people themselves, through the conference that was organised at Uluru, the Statement from the Heart. It's a modest proposal. It is a very generous proposal. All that it says, it's not a third chamber of Parliament, all it says is, on matters that affect First Nations people, they should be consulted. That's just good manners. It doesn't give them a right of veto. They won't have a vote in the Parliament, none of that. And this is a modest change. I am hopeful that over a period of time, support can be got for it. I am not optimistic in the short term because Scott Morrison has ruled it out. He wants to have a stage of just voting on whether Indigenous Australians be recognised in the Constitution, and a legislated voice to Parliament is, I think, where the government's likely to land. But it seems to me that at the stage in which we give that constitutional recognition, we will fail if we don't do it in a way that has the respect of the people who we're trying to recognise in order to correct an injustice that's been there for so long.
Malcolm Turnbull, do you have any regrets that you as Prime Minister rejected the enshrined voice to Parliament?
No, not at all. I'm a Republican in every respect, and just going back to what I said to Hanan, I believe that our constitutionally enshrined national representative bodies should be ones that are open to every Australian, regardless of their race or background in any respect. In other words, open to every Australian citizen. It is very important for that First Australians have a greater voice, and you know, whether it is operating at a local level or at a peak body level, that's something that I've always supported, and indeed, as I did with in Tennant Creek not long before the coup in August last year, I went down and and set up a plan to have greater consultation, greater voice, greater engagement between the Indigenous community, the local government, the territory government. In fact, I was talking to the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory about it just today. So greater voice, greater autonomy, greater say is vitally important, but just an issue of principle. I think one of the genius of our country is that which gives us the right to be in one of our national representative bodies is just one thing: Australian citizenship. So that's why I did not support that approach,
Pat,
and that's the reason.
Well, let me bring Pat Turner in. And do you accept that argument now? And do you think the Indigenous people, having made the Uluru Statement, are prepared to compromise?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, the Minister, Ken Wyatt, has appointed a senior advisory committee and to advise him on, structures that are likely to be legislated rather than enshrined constitutionally.
That is a compromise. Do you accept that?
That is a compromise. Well, look, I think some good can come of it if we get regional authorities, which are stronger than regional councils that we had under ATSEC. And at the moment, with the Closing the Gap process that we have with all of the governments, we are very clear on decision-making at the local, regional, state and national level being shared, which we have it right now with the governments on Closing the Gap. But we have to take it at every level and reflect that, like you did with Tennant Creek, Malcolm. That's got to be allowed to happen right throughout the country.
That's a big idea.
And so we do have that, and so far we've had support. But what all the governments have to do is come good with the money. You can't close the gap without the proper investment of resources that we know where that money needs to be invested. So a lot of the current money, and myself, I'm not wedded to the targets. They were a waste of time in my view, because no national data is consistent. No national data is consistent. The only thing you can measure is life expectancy. And everything else is inconsistent because every state has its own system. Very hard to get a national picture, even though we're less than 1 million people, for goodness sake, as First Nations people. So, you know, there is a lot of investment that needs to be made with us at the table advising government how and where and when to make that investment. Okay. And housing and the environment is absolutely key to being the game changer here.
Okay, now you're watching, thank you. You're watching the final Q&A for 2019. I'm trying to rush because we've got quite a few questions to get to. The next question comes from Marco Ho.
Blue sky research in countries such as the US has resulted in touchscreens, GPS, and photolithography, the underpinnings of a multi-billion hardware industry. Meanwhile, past and present governments have been consistently undermining Australian research, most recently cutting a $3.9 billion education investment fund, research support programs, and university block grants. How do we ensure that we support the research and entrepreneurship that will drive innovation in our economy over the next decade?
Brian Schmidt.
Well, I wish I actually knew the answer to that question. It's a conversation I've been having with pretty much every parliamentarian over the last decade. So I think for us it's getting that argument, realizing that the future of Australia will be better and brighter if we are able to take knowledge and the great know-how that is across this country and convert it into some sort of prosperity for our citizenry. For whatever reason, the ability to take that investment in our university systems is felt by parliament after parliament as sort of not working terribly well. Yet we remain a very, very prosperous society, and we actually embed technology throughout our society. It's one of the reasons we're so prosperous. So for me, it's about trying to figure out why there's that disconnect, and it is certainly true that it is difficult for universities to meet up with Australian businesses and figure out how to use our research especially. The real deep tech we invent here in Australia, it seems to be more useful overseas. Why is that? Well, there's no ecosystem right now. And so our industries here are not very research intensive. They tend to be very good at development. There's only a few that can really use what we develop. So I think we need to figure out how to create that ecosystem. But we're a long ways from doing it, and I'm afraid right now we seem to be just saying, nah, this is too hard. Let's just go back and do the same thing we've been doing for the last 50 years.
So, Brian, the $3.9 billion cut came in the last budget, and there'd been previous cuts, $2 billion in 2017, 2.2, I think. So, what are the consequences of these cuts serially happening, budget to budget?
Yeah, well, I mean, the cuts have been happening bits and bobs every year for the last 10, really. And so we have had the luxury of developing a $35 billion export education. And that is what has actually floated everything. But that is a boom that is not going to last forever. So we are becoming quite precarious. So
you think governments were penalising you for success, saying you've got a lot of money from this, so we're going to take...
I'm not sure we've been penalised, but we have filled the gap by being very entrepreneurial. But I would say we have probably overexpanded into what I think is a reasonable long-term expectation. So there is going to be some shake-ups over the next 5 to 10 years. And at that point, either Australia is going to have to step up and find the money that it should already be spending, or we're going to completely collapse the research sector in this country.
Sisonke.
Yeah, I think this the point about research is mirrored when you look at the arts funding in this country. I think the announcement that was made last week is shocking. I think the creative industry drives a huge amount of income generation for this country. It's a pathway to the future. I think when you look at the educational outcomes and what's happening with basic education and this kind of, all of these, so the momentum of the phenomenal growth that this country has witnessed in the last 30 years cannot sustain itself without long-term planning, thinking, and investment. So once again, we come back to this point, which I think has been a theme throughout this conversation, which is this idea of short-termism versus long-termism, that the hard decisions have to be made to invest in things that are going to pay off for a generation that won't be around to benefit from it. But that's what life is, right? That's what survival is. That's what human survival is at an existential level. We have to do these really hard things that will be very beneficial for us in the long term.
Anthony Albanese, do you take that point? And is part of the problem here that governments in Australia are currently obsessed with achieving budget surpluses?
Well, I think they're certainly obsessed with the short term rather than long term thinking. And in the short term, a cut to research looks like something that's easy because there's not an immediate impact on it, as opposed to cutting a pension or doing something that's more direct. But in the long term, what it does is, instead of looking at it as a cost, it's got to be looked at as an investment that will produce a return. In human terms, this country has been extraordinary. We punch way above our weight in terms of inventions. What we do, though, is not commercialise them properly, so we lose the opportunity. And in today's globalised world as well, the big danger for us in the cutback on research is the brain drain, is that some of our smartest people are going to the US or going to places in our region to study and make a contribution there, and we're losing those people. And it's a tragedy. It's something that does need to be addressed.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Look, I've got a lot of sympathy with everything that's been said, but I just want to conclude on a more positive note. If you go back 5 or 6 years, there was only about $150 million raised for venture capital in Australia. It was very, very hard to raise money for technology, for applied technology. Since then, and I think the National Innovation and Science Agenda that I launched in 2015 had a big hand in this. It's acknowledged too by people in the industry. You now have the amount of money available in VC every year is well over 10 times that amount. I have never in my lifetime, and I've been involved in innovation and tech for a long time, I've never seen as dynamic an Australian technology ecosystem as there is today. There are so many smart Australians with their innovations, their inventions, if you like, their new ideas, being able to raise money here in Australia and get on with it. And that's the area I've been working in since I stopped being in politics, because that's what I came from. I've been a serial entrepreneur all my life. I'm a great believer in entrepreneurship, and I think there is more. The ecosystem is more dynamic and healthier now than it's ever been, but we've got a long way to go. In terms of research, everyone's correct. Australian universities were pretty poor at cooperating with industry and commercialising their developments. That too has improved. It was an objective of the NISA. That's why we set up the CSIRO fund that is now managed by Main Sequence Ventures, and that's what it's doing, as Brian would know, is literally making sure that you're matching great innovation and research with commercial applications, because that's how you can create the jobs here in Australia. So I think we're on the right track, but we've got more to go. And I can just tell you, as someone who's been knocking around in this area for a long time, it is so much better now than it was 5 years, let alone 25 years ago.
Okay,
but
quick,
shouldn't be complacent.
Very quick answer on this one, because we've got to move on. But $3.9 billion cut in the last budget to university research funds, good or bad idea?
Oh, look, I don't want to get into a critique on the last budget.
You were so optimistic a moment ago, so I'm...
Well, no, but look, can I just say to you that research, what you've got to do is develop a dynamic ecosystems are the term, but what it basically means lots of sources of capital. The government is not the only source of capital for research. We are not the Soviet Union. And what you've got to do is get the private sector and investors to invest and play their part. And I'm telling you, quite seriously, since I got out of politics, it's like, I was in politics 14 years. I wasn't very involved in the investment world other than at the remoteness of Canberra. I am so inspired by the amount of innovation, the amount of enthusiasm and the courage that you're starting to see Australian investors, both individuals and funds, are having. So it's a lot better than it was, but we've got to do better. And if, you know, I mean, this is the key. I know it's not popular to talk about it anymore, but innovation is the key.
Okay.
Innovation is the key to productivity, and that's the key to our prosperity.
All right, thank you. Time for one last question. Thank you very much. One last question for the year, in fact. It comes from George Lynn. George.
Thanks very much, Tony. The art of obfuscation, equivocation and evasion when answering questions appears to be very popular amongst politicians. How do we ensure that our elected representatives demonstrate integrity and remain accountable to us, their constituents?
Let's hear first from our non-politicians. Sisonke.
So this is one area where I feel sorry for politicians, actually, because I think the reason why they refuse to give a straight answer is because voters are incredibly fickle, and voters will change their minds often. And so what that means is that instead of knowing that they can count on a base over a long period of time to make difficult, long-term decisions, politicians are jumping around, trying to please everybody, trying to say the right thing, not demonstrating an honesty, and so voters pick up on that and they punish them for it. So we have this cycle of mistrust that develops between politicians and between the public. And I think this is where there needs to be accountability on both sides. So of course politicians need to be more honest, but I also think that the electorate, we who vote for people, should be prepared to hear the truth, listen to it, and stick with people who are going to make tough decisions, because we are living in a moment where there are many, many difficult, hard things that need to be decided upon, and you can't be jumping around from party to party, and partisanship is at its lowest ever. So I do think that that's something that is on us.
Now, Brian, here's some research your university was able to do recently. Your latest study shows only 25% of those surveyed after the last election believe the people in government can be trusted. What do you think is driving that?
Well, I think it comes down to this very short-termism and the inability to, you know, properly manage what I think is the new media. The new media works like that, and our politicians seem to want to react on a 24/7 basis, and that just undermines, I think, the whole cycle. So if you look at, for example, the two leaders in the last election, neither achieved 50% for being honest or trustworthy by the electorate as they were perceived. So how, when we have a democracy which has got its lowest level of trust ever, 59% now say democracy is working well, how is that going to work unless we trust our leaders? So I think we need our leaders to take some stock of our citizenry and say they are going to actually back us in if we hold a sensible line over 3 years. But that means transparency. It means being able to deliver bad news, trying to explain the trade-offs, and hopefully saying the average voter, can actually process that and not just instantly turn off, which seems to be how we treat them right now.
Pat?
I think that politicians need to be open, transparent and accountable to their constituents and be more honest and tell us, you know, what they want to take forward. And I also think that the role of journalists has been belittled. I think that probably most of the journalists in the press gallery would be wondering why they ever got into the profession, given that every politician they ask a question of just ignores the question and tells them what they think, the latest buzz that the party room is, you know, wanting to put out there. And I think that you know, it's undermined our confidence, the way that journalist homes have been raided. And I think that I'd like to see more investigative journalism, and I think the stories that do come out, like the Four Corners programs and so on, and I know that your wife was responsible for producing a number of those, but they have been very revealing, haven't they? And Australians have really embraced getting the facts and making sure that there's an appropriate response. So that's what we want. and we want them all to be honest and accountable to us. And that means the media has an important role to play, especially our trusted journalists, not just the ABC, all of them. And we want them to report, what's actually going on, not what some politician wants to just sort of blurb, as the latest thought bubble.
Okay, now I'm going to give the politicians each 30 seconds because we're pretty much out of time. And Malcolm, can I put it to you, a question in the form of a question, how hard was it for you as Prime Minister to be completely honest when you had at your back political enemies who are waiting for you to trip up at any moment?
Well, yes, I certainly did, but I didn't find it hard to be honest. I mean, there are times when you have to be circumspect, say on matters of national security.
Sure.
But generally, the criticism I received about answering questions was that I answered them at too great a length rather than not answering them at all.
Okay, well, fair enough. You weren't going to prove that one tonight. Anthony Albanese.
Well, the first thing that we clearly need to do is to have a National Integrity Commission.
Yes.
So that
people
agree with that.
Anthony,
just Malcolm Turnbull, so National Integrity Commission.
Yeah, it was actually in the works. Literally, the bill was being prepared before I regrettably ended my Prime Ministership prematurely. But I was like Albo.
You managed to get in again, man.
Yeah, no, but I can just say, no, but seriously, I mean, Anthony and I both come from New South Wales, and we both, I think, over the years have been pretty sceptical about ICACs because of the experience here in this state, and the sort of, the public spectacle of it all.
Now we need to get a hold of that short answer.
But seriously, I'm absolutely the view that we need a National Integrity Commission or a federal ICAC, whatever you want to call it, and we do need it, and it is more obvious that it is needed all the time.
Okay, Anthony Albanese, back to you.
And with real power. So to investigate what it decides to investigate, and with the powers effectively, absolutely. So effectively the powers of an ongoing Royal Commission, which you can do while addressing things like some of the shows that have been on in New South Wales aren't really productive for in terms of justice. So I think all them can be dealt with. But the broader question about answering questions, it's an issue. It's an issue because at the moment you have people say, oh, that's just the bubble, or the latest method is to say that's just gossip. When something's asked, is it a fact or not? I think the journalists, the media, have to hold people to account. Some people say that doesn't matter. I think it does.
I do too.
We tried to hold Angus Taylor to account in the last fortnight over a range of comments he's made, which clearly are misleading. The City of Sydney document on top of, that's the fourth issue he's been involved in. And it's just this rolling disaster area for the government. That undermines confidence. Yeah. But I also think that politicians we have a responsibility to try and put broader statements out. So I've been doing these big speeches, I've done 3 of them, trying to not just do a grab, they're not aimed at getting, there's no dollars attached, they're not aimed at getting a short-term headline, but to talk about the challenges of jobs and the future of work, of how climate change policy...
Anthony, I can't let you have the 4th one here tonight because we're actually out of
trying.
Okay. That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Malcolm Turnbull, Pat Turner, Sisonke Msimang, Anthony Albanese and Brian Schmidt. Thank you very much. You can continue the discussion over Christmas dinner or Hanukkah or the summer solstice. This is the last Q&A for 2019, the last Q&A ever. The programme's creator, executive producer, Peter McAvoy. Next year, Hamish McDonald will be sitting in this chair. I hope you'll join him and the team on the first Monday in February and for many years of lively Q&As. This is my last regular appearance on Q&A. I'll be back from time to time to fill in for Hamish. We'll leave you tonight with a sample from the last 12 years. And if strong language offends, please close your ears. On behalf of everyone at Q&A, a safe summer break and Happy New Year. Good night.
Good evening and welcome to the very first Q&A, what we like to call a new adventure in democracy where you get to ask the questions.
How big of a tool is Mark Latham?
My question doesn't actually go out to the panel tonight, it goes to this beautiful girl next to me. Will you marry me?
You can join the live Twitter conversation by following the hashtag, whatever that is, on your screen right now.
You're a parliamentarian in Australia who believes the world you live in is less than 10,000
I remain caught in the illusion of Maya ordinary reality. I perceive myself as an agent killing you.
What the fuck? Oh my god! These people are fucking lunatics.
What was a Facebook question? While Barry's just going to deal with his phone, that's probably your agent just wondering if that was a very good joke.
You've got a big ass, Julia. Just get on.
Attack on Q&A, calling it elitist, boring and costly.
Deny the existence of homosexuals in North Queensland. They exist. There's an app called Grindr. I'll put it on your phone.
The word Muslim because of where I was born.
Are you Muslim?
Law in this country, and it is the Australian law. It's not Sharia law.
Don't try and suppress me, and don't call me a problem.
No, we're not going to do that. Please. And this is for your Forget it. Okay, you're watching.
Relax.
You've never considered it?
But forming a political party with Kevin.
Malcolm and I could never agree on the leadership.
It's you and Julia couldn't either. Okay, you're watching Q&A. It's live and unusual.
Is there anything that's going to do this job? Kick his ass.
Who said that?
So we'll take that as a comment.
Of women who do endure violence.
hysterical.
The graph.
One brief example.
I haven't mowed the lawn for a long time.
3.141592653. Our government is going to deport a 10-year-old boy.
If you lift my tax-free threshold, that changes my life.
I have not been able to secure my NDIS funding.
589793238460.
Australia needs to wake up.
You, or how would you suggest people like me have a go to get a go?
In the face of catastrophe, compassion, courage, vision.
It's definitely a struggle when you're living in a society where you think you're welcomed. You think that, you know, the people around you are going to be there. Sorry, it's difficult to then have to just justify yourself to the people who you thought were standing behind you.
26433832950288419.
I don't know what you're on about, darling.
We're going to make this very quick, Larissa, and we'll just hear from you.
Let's turn now to the Labor Party.
A little bit touchy
Grace,
at the moment,
next
Tony, so
question.
careful.